1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, there's many out there that may swear that 4 is more. Today we're actually going to go ahead and talk about 5 strings, give you a little brief history of where they came from and the lowdown on this versatile instrument. Stick around. Hello everybody, this is Carlos with Alamo Music Center here in beautiful downtown San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel, like our videos, sign up for notifications. As always, we got a lot of content coming out and we don't want you to miss any of it. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about the 5-string. A beautiful one that we have here by Fender, and that's actually a good reason where to start off actually. Let's go down a brief history of the 5-string. It may come to no shock of anybody that the first 5 strings were actually introduced by Fender back in 1965. Now, there is some claims out there that I've found through research that there was actually a Dan Electro 1959 5-string bass that was produced. As far as I can tell from trying to research it as much as I can, trying to locate anything about it, these are unsubstantiated and I can't find anything other than a regular 4-string. Now, if I'm wrong and you do know more about it, please let us know in the comments because I would love to get more information about that. Maybe we can even do a video on it down the line. But for what is documented, for what we do have a good record of, 1965 to 1971, Fender releases the Fender Bass 5, or V, depending on the Roman numeral. But either way, during this time, Fender releases the first 5-string bass, just like they released the first bass in general. Now this bass though, while its influence exists today in what I'm actually holding right here in the Fender J bass 5-string, it actually was a little different than what we know today and what we're seeing here today. So for starters, the way it was originally designed was with what's known as a high C tuning. So that means that as opposed to the standard tuning we've come to kind of accept as the standard, I guess, for 5-string, which is going to be B, E, A, D, G, utilizing that lower B. The original bass 5 was tuned to a high C tuning, meaning that it was using E, A, D, G, C, wherein by this E was this same tone. This was just the higher C. Now this was designed in order to try and be able to accommodate higher tones, higher melodies, and open up the melodic spectrum for players that were more in the fusion, jazz spectrum, which at the time was the predominant music choice where the electric bass was starting to get a little bit more hold as well too. Now, for whatever reason, call it ahead of its time. Maybe it was before its time, maybe, I don't know, it needed to be refined. But either way, musicians in that time did not connect with the bass 5. They didn't. With issues stemming from its shape, its size, and even the string gap, that the string gap was a little bit too closed off as well too. Either way, all of these things culminate, the 1971 hits, and the 5-string bass is discontinued. Now be mindful, this wouldn't actually be the last time we would see the bass 5 body, as the surplus of repurposed ones were repurposed actually, for the Fender Swinger series, which was released around like a short run in the 70s. And then a few years back at the time of this shooting in 2016, Squier released a Gary Jarman signature where the body of that Squier one was influenced by the original bass 5 body. Unfortunately, the bass 5 hasn't been lost to time, and many of them still do exist today on auction and trader sites like reverb.com right now, fetching a pretty penny. I think I found one going for about maybe 6,000 or so. But either way, 1971 hits, as I mentioned, Fender stops producing 5-strings. Well, this is ironic. And why is it ironic? Because it's actually around this time that the 5-string that we know today started taking shape. Through the efforts of companies like Allenbeck and luthiers like Michael Tobias making high-end custom orders of 5-strings at the time, the newer modern 5-string as we know it today started taking its shape, even accommodating to the way that it was tuned, the difference of tuning. Now, talking 1965, the 5-string is introduced. Fast forward 21 years. If you had had a child when the 5-string came out, this child can drink now in US laws. It's 1986, and now we're finally getting, probably for the first time really, the first mass-produced, mass-produced 5-string bass. And that was going to be the Stingray 5, which actually to this day is still an extremely popular bass. And the company went on itself to be bought by Ernie Ball, now being produced as the Stingray. And a lot of these bass guitars are super popular with musicians from all walks of life and genre for the versatility, for the way that they've incorporated active pickups. But in general, they have the history of that first regular kind of release. And that's 1986. Now, it would still take a few years for the 5-string to gain traction, and it wouldn't be until around the 90s, a few years later, that we really started seeing the 5-string get its weight, going as far as even having Fender finally, after about now going on about 30 some odd years, close to 30 years, reintroducing a 5-string to its catalog. Now, this doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is. By doing so, that also accommodated for a lot more smaller end luthiers that worked with Fender and that worked as a subsidiary of Fender and partnered with Fender to have access to schematics and material made to be able to produce more 5-strings, meaning the circulation expanded not just by one company, but by any therein subsidiary, derivative, partner that was working with Fender in producing their design either for a sub-brand, off-brand, or anything of that nature. So the 5-string is invented in the 60s to an extent, and the people that it was originally intended for weren't really working for it, didn't really like it, and so then it comes to the 90s and it's getting popular and starting to really gain more traction and becoming a staple to what we know today. So why is that? Oh, gotta take a breath. That's a good starting off point, and I can have B-roll there. This is where I'm gonna talk about that. So while by no means of stretch of the imagination is this the only reason why the 5-string stayed, I think the first and foremost that we want to mention is the versatility of the 5-string. The versatility probably first and foremost is the reason why it was able to enter the ether of the bass guitars and carve itself out a section where it is here to stay. As I mentioned earlier, we, as a general rule, and we're not even talking about down tuning and all this other stuff, but as a general standard, we have the low B. B-E-A-D-G. But as I mentioned, we do also have E-A-D-G-C. Why is this important? Is that means that we have two different avenues and two different, completely different spectrums to where we can utilize a 5-string bass. So where would we use both? Let's give some quick examples. When we're talking about that low B, that deep, heavy B, and this is without even down tuning, because mind you can still tune it down to a C, tune it down to an A, maybe even lower than that, depending on how thick your gauges are. But in general, when we're talking about that low deepness you get, well, now we're talking about the sub-tones and basses that were popularized by R&B. Now we're talking about that deep guttural feel that you get when you listen to metal. We're talking about even hard rock. We're talking about a richer undertone that's going to more enhance the weight of these distorted guitars where a lot of it is mid-scooped or where we have a lot more of a distortion bend. We have a lot more of that, a lot more of the low scoop. Mid. We have where the bass fills out and actually helps with not just filling out the space, but almost enhancing that entire space altogether because of how low those lows are. So that's just talking about one tuning. Now when we go to the C, what do we get? Well, now we have an entire range of notes going as far high as you feel comfortable playing on your fretboard, where you can open up the spectrum to what notes can be played, what can be done. So there's also open tunings where we can create more chorded tunings. There's also open tunings where we can create things for tapping. That versatility, first and foremost, is probably one of the reasons why it carved a niche out. But ultimately, some people had to put it on the radar. Now, while there have been very notable people to use a 5-string, such as notable jazz bassist Esperanza Spalding, who uses a 5-string in conjunction with double bass and 4-string, I would be remiss to say that the grunge scene, the hard rock scene, the metal scene of the early 90s going into the 2000s wasn't one of the bigger catalysts that helped put these at least on the radar and on the map, if not part of the reason why the popularity started rising. When we look back to that era, we had, Tom Hamilton of Aerosmith, we had Jason Newsted of Metallica. And if you know Metallica in any history, by the time that Jason Newsted joined, we're not talking about underground pug Metallica. We're talking about very big, on the map Metallica. When you have young kids that want to be these guys, see a 5-string, what do you think they're going to want to buy? We also had, David Ellefson from Megadeth, probably one of my more favorite bass players that they utilized at their time too, and possibly even because of his usage of the 5-string. Faith No More as well, Billy Gold. He also utilized a 5-string as well. And now, this is not to say that, like I said, Miss Spalding, jazz, R&B, a lot of these artists utilize a 5-string. But it seemed as if during this spectrum, these bands really started embracing the 5-string more than utilizing it. The 5-string became an extension of what they were going to play. It wasn't a matter of just an extra tool. the tool to have a 4-string and a 5-string wasn't needed. The tools of the 4-string are right here, 1, 2, 3, 4. But we weren't going to create a sacrifice for that 5th string tool by just having a 4-string. So probably no better embodiment of this is going to be Fieldy from Korn, who, for myself and I can say many people, probably was one of the first times that you really realized the bass guitar. When you heard this distinction of the slap and the pop, and you heard something that didn't sound like anything else you've heard before, really. It probably was the first time, at least for a lot of us younger cats, that it put the bass guitar on notice. That it wasn't just the lows, it wasn't just something in the background. And that's not even talking about acts like Limp Bizkit, and I really wish that his name was coming to me. Yeah, I do apologize, but we had guys like Wes Borland alongside with their bass player, both doing bass at the same time on certain tracks. Their bass player utilizing a 4-string, but also a 5-string at times as well too, helped with propelling all that. So while not 100% the reason why, again, I would be remiss to say that without those early metal scenes of the 90s, there is a chance that maybe the 5-string, while not fading to time, maybe wouldn't have been given the weight it needed to become a standard. And who knows, maybe that could have possibly impacted the world we live in now, where we live in the world of the 6-string, the 7-string, 8-string, 12-string. So the best way to realize how the 5-string was versatile and why it stayed is really just to hear it out. And we're going to do something special. I know normally when you've seen the videos we do here, I do a demo where I do kind of the same type of riff so you can get an understanding of the different places where it can go. But this time I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is actually, and what I did was I'm going to just go off the cuff. Improv everything, what I feel, what I think is there, where I think it should start, where I think it should go. Now the reason why I'm doing that is because this is not a video to review this bass. Now, this is a beautiful bass and we'll probably review it at some juncture of time if we haven't already done so. But what we're going to be doing right now is we're going to be reviewing more the concept of the bass so that you can see how and I'll admit, hands in the air right now fully, I am a predominant 4-string bass. If you can see the other side of the camera, one of my buddies who's a bass player is always constantly telling me, you need to get a 5-string, need to get a 6-string. If it was up to him, I'd probably be playing a 12-string. But point is, I am very strictly, I only need the 4 or not. So with that being said, and with that in mind, have a taste of what the 5-string does for me in terms of creativity, to being exposed to making up something on the spot when I'm so used to improvising on 4. And that way you can hopefully get a better understanding of not just how a 5-string sounds, but also how a 5-string can even influence the differences in how you play. Just stick around, and then we'll talk a little bit more about 5-strings as well. So I want to apologize. I know there might have been some weird parts there, but again, I wasn't trying to just show off the tone. I wasn't really trying to get you to understand just how good it sounds, because this especially does sound amazing. But it really was just more about how the creative juices flow on just going for it, on just that improv, where we don't have a set idea, where we don't have a set thing to think about. We're just playing to see where the bass kind of takes us as well. So tone-wise, I mean, obviously, we have that lower note. You were able to hear how good it sounds, all that good stuff. But let's talk a little bit more pros and cons. I'm not going to go out and say you need to get a 5-string. Ultimately, it's always going to be a matter of preference, and there's no right or wrong answer between 5 and 4. But why would we choose a 5-string over a 4-string? Or maybe why wouldn't we? So for starters, we're going to have extended range. And as I mentioned, that extended range exists in more than one way. The way I was jamming, the way I was playing, and this is probably just because we don't have the proper strings to do it, but the way we were playing, we were utilizing just the B note. You know, we didn't want to have to take out the strings and restring it completely to do the higher C tuning as well, since it would have to revert back to this tuning for the purposes of the store and the shop. But they both exist. You have an extended range that either goes lower, sub bass. We're talking about you want to do hip hop, R&B, you want to do metal, you want to do hard rock. We have the potential to have the higher C tuning. Now we have higher notes. Maybe you do solo bass work, bass, lead bass, solo bass. Maybe you're a fusion artist, maybe you're a jazz artist. Now, I want to preface though, these aren't hard and fast rules. You can use either tuning in either style, and it has been done before. But for the most part, you'll tend to find that that's how it's split. But either way, look at the genres that I mentioned. We have metal, hard rock, fusion, jazz. There's a lot of 4-strings that can be said about this as well when we get into more of the higher end spectrum versus the lower end. But the immediate versatility that's there is going to be one that's going to be created just by its mere existence of it being there. We don't have to detune, we don't have to downtune, we don't have to change anything, we don't have to find anything higher end that has these kind of more higher spectrum based things. It just naturally exists by the mere extension of that extra string and that extended range that we have. So what else do we have as a benefit here? Well, another thing you may not consider is string gap. Ultimately, the string gap, for the most part, not always, but for the most part, the string gap in between strings is going to be slightly shorter, slightly smaller, I mean. And the reason for that is going to be because of the fact that we have to have a shorter kind of gap to offset the fact that there is such a longer neck that pretty much is always going to be needed. Now, don't get me wrong, you may not always need a humongous neck, and how wide the neck is going to vary and how wide it's going to be on the 5-string spectrum is the same as a 4-string, varying by manufacturer, product style, and all that good stuff. But for the most part, you're going to need a wider neck when we're talking about 5-string. So in order not to make that neck extraordinarily wide, the string gap is usually a little bit closer in together for the most part, which means that being able to hit some licks will be a little bit easier on those higher spectrums because you will not have to stretch as far to get them. Now, what else do we have for this? So with the 5-string, it also presents to us something else, something that maybe we're not always going to need. If you're a hobbyist, this maybe doesn't apply to you, but if you are thinking about taking professionally or maybe on a more bigger scale, what else does the 5-string provide us? Opportunity. Opportunities to jam with musicians we maybe otherwise wouldn't have been able to play with. Opportunities to play with larger field of scope where we're going to. You have somebody that posts online, hey, we're a gent deathcore metal band. This can do that. Hey, we're a jazz fusion group with influences of Jocko. Well, this can do that too. So you can't always necessarily say that easily. Can be done, and maybe we'll do a video on it someday, but there's a large school of thought about detuning a 4-string and having detuned 4-strings, what that means, what that does, and a whole culture related to detuned 4-strings versus the 5. But ultimately, whether you agree with it, don't agree with it, one thing is just in general factual regardless of what. Detuning your strings, tuning your strings, changing your tunings on a consistent basis is going to wear them out sooner. It's just naturally going to happen. We're talking about constant change in tension and pressure, reducing it, increasing it, going up, going down. Whether or not we're talking about agreeing with detuning a bass, the point is you're still going to do that. And the amount of detuning that is needed to bring an E down to the ability to play this open B if you have a bass right now, do it, and then tell me if you want the rest of your strings to feel that way. And if you don't like that, tell me if you want to have much fatter strings on just that spectrum. And also the thing is to consider with that tautness and that tightness, sometimes that can also create whole other skew of issues too. Well, like I said, maybe we can get into a video about that school of thought. But the point is, either way, there isn't, that whole diatribe is moot. It's irrelevant. Why? You don't have to worry about that. This goes down to a B. If you're not into that, you want it higher, this goes up to a C. And again, we're talking 5-string, but we're not even talking about a 6-string or 7-string, which also do exist in that same vein, which possibly could have both. You know, mostly a 6-string. 7-string, 8-string, we're pushing it, really, really pushing it. And to be honest, and just so that way there's no clarity, confusion, a lot of the times when you see that phrase 8-string, we're not talking a lot of the times about a really fat 8-string neck, though those do exist. A lot of the time what they're talking about is the doubled up 4-string, kind of like a 12-string guitar works. So 8 strings do exist on a more standard spectrum like that, but nowadays, you can find a full-length 8-string if needed. There's some people out there that have gone as far as in the 20s and 30s just on some crazy stuff. It's doable now, and really right here is the reason why. The popularity of 5-string does what? It brings the opportunity to say, let's do 6, let's do more. And that in and of itself is another advantage point. You start playing a 5-string, you realize you like that scale length, you like that difference, you start realizing, hey, I like the idea of having the bass provide me more melodic versatility, having more notes to play. So maybe by playing a 5-string, you open up your spectrum to wanting to do a 6-string, because now you want to enhance your style and technique. And maybe by simply adding a few extra notes at one point, you might even change the way that you play by the mere love of knowing that you have that extra melodic input on the bass spectrum. So as a launching off point, it's also the greatest and most easiest way to launch in. Now, everything I mentioned is awesome. It is. But, you know, two-face, right? There's side of the coin, heads or tails, and that's kind of the same deal with everything I just mentioned. So, yeah, I mentioned the string gap, and I mentioned how it's smaller. And again, we're not talking about a humongous difference. It's not like, you know, your regular neck is like this small, but yeah, it is wider. And realistically speaking, if you don't have any comfort in your hand playing a 4-string, 5-string's not gonna get any easier. So with that being said, 5-strings, and while they come in various shapes and sizes, and there's even boutiques that can even create short scale 5-strings too, for the most part, if we have a situation where you're kind of smaller, you may not have as much comfortability in going to a 5-string right away. This is not going to get any easier if you have any difficulties from the 4-string. Remember, with practice, with time, anything will become second nature and practicing, but as to how quickly that learning gap is closed off is really going to be based on you. Secondly, there's more maintenance. 5-string packs are a lot more expensive than 4-string packs. And while this may not be an issue for people that don't play a lot, this is going to be a problem if you do play a lot, record a lot, change your strings a lot. The more frequently you change your strings, that cost is going to add up over time. So that's one thing to take into account. And, you know, as I mentioned with opportunity as well too, while that opportunity does exist there, remember that with those added opportunities comes the fact that you will be using this bass. And there is no surprise there. For the most part, most 5-strings are going to be heavier than 4-strings. And over time, that wear and tear is going to be an issue compared to that same time frame playing a 4-string. So, you know, ultimately there really isn't any pros or cons that are going to be deal breakers, in my opinion. It's really going to come down to your preference. And of course, if you want any more holistic, you know, a bespoke answer, something more personal about 5-strings, always, if you're in the San Antonio area, come down to Alamo Music Center where you will be more than happy to help you. Or if you're not, go to alamomusic.com, chat with us and get us know more information. We'll be more than happy to help you out on your particular part of your music journey. Do you by any chance out there already have a 5-string? Do you like 5-string versus 4-string? Are you a 6-string person? Tell us about that in the comments because we love to hear from you. And I'm sure that everybody else as well too loves to hear about any stories about your 5-string as well too. So once again, this is Carlos. Hopefully this video was able to teach you more about where the 5-string came from, maybe give you a more idea of whether or not you want to get one. But either way, we can't wait to hear from you. Let us know in the comments about your stories with 5-strings. And you have a great rest of your day.